This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. A grain market update from K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien begins today's show as he discusses upcoming USDA reports and why the futures market has declined. Keeping the show rolling is Romulo Lollato, K-State wheat production specialist with the wheat harvest update. He explains how the wet weather has impacted harvest progress, wheat yield, and wheat quality. K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond ends the show with safety reminders about lightning and his forecast that includes potentially more rain and storms. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Friday show with a grain market update from K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien. Dan, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Shelby.
Dan, wanting to begin our conversation, reminding people of some upcoming USDA reports.
Within the hour at 11 a.m. Central Time today, the USDA the NAS, National Ag Statistics Service, will release their acreage report and the quarterly stocks report. And, when we circled dates on the calendar before we started planting crops, sitting back there in February, March, looking forward, it's this day that we thought would hold potential for a price volatility, for supply-demand determination for the grain market. So it'll be important to see what these results are. And the main two commodities that we're looking for across the U.S. are corn and soybeans. In Kansas, and of course there'll be wheat numbers also, and hard red winter all pretty much done, but spring wheat, especially to the north, still in question with regard to what the final acreages were. We'll be watching grain sorghum numbers also here in Kansas, both for the acreage and for the stocks reports. But anyway, the USDA came out in their prospective plantings report on March 31st of this year and estimated corn acres at 95,326,000 acres. The pre-report estimates are for about 95,350,000, so up about 25 million acres, not much. So in my thinking, what really matters on this report will be whether we get some number that falls near or outside of the range of pre-report estimates, and and it would take that probably to move the market in one direction or the other. So the average trade estimate, of course, 95,350,000 for corn. The low end estimate on the very low side is 93,750,000. The high end is 96,800,000 acres. So you got a range of about just under 94 to over 97. That if we get some surprise in corn acres, that could come about. Now, is that expected? No, but there are people that are measuring that surprise. Of course, all of this is up from last year when we had about 90,600,000 acres approximately. So when we look at the corn market being relatively lower and no threats at this time to the U.S. national corn yield, yes, in pockets, of course. So this higher corn acreage number by about 4.5 million acres it weighs on the market. If we came in and saw some planted acreage number that was towards the low end of that range, a surprise to people, that could have a supportive impact on the market. I frankly think if it's high, if we get something over the USDA's early projection, I don't know that you'll have a lot more bearishness, So it's really something on the low side. And for soybeans, I recall that March 31st report, as it came out, we were surprised that soybean acres was projected in the prospective plantings report at the end of March at 83,495,000. So yeah, that's what it was. Now this projection comes in at a little bit higher than that, 83,655,000. Frankly, if anything was going to change around, given some rainfall, et cetera, I would wonder about the soybean number shifting. On the low end, you've got a trade estimate of about 82,500,000. That again, so 83,655,000 as an average estimate. Some of the respective trading companies that give pre-report estimates come in and said that we could have something as low as 82,500,000. So that's something to watch. I am also I think we need to watch the sorghum number. The USDA came out in the that prospective plantings report at the end of March and projected 6.595 million acres of grain sorghum planted, and a lot of that in Kansas, Texas, and Oklahoma. Kansas primarily. So we'll be looking to see how that acreage came about. So for the wheat number for winter wheat, which is really what we're after, the USDA projected 33,315,000 in the earlier report, and now in pre-report estimates for this report are about 33,300,000. So really no change, no appreciable change expected, which means we're at risk to a surprise. So I'd watch that. The other side of this, of the ledger for this report at 11, will be the trade estimates for U.S. quarterly grain stocks. Of course, we report on the estimates of what the stocks are, and what we're really looking after is what was the use the last quarter. So we'll be watching this pretty closely, this report for any indication of higher or lower than expected usage, especially for corn. And for wheat, we could enter into that too, because what we're really trying to ferret out of all that is whether feed use was higher or not. We have a pretty good idea of ethanol usage, of exports, all this other stuff, all these other categories, but we don't have really any other way to measure feed usage other than these quarterly reports. We can make estimates of it, but the feed number is a residual. We figure everything else and figure how much we got left. And then if that doesn't make sense, then we start going back in history and thinking, well, did we estimate the size of last year's crop right? So that report, that type of calculus or algebra really doesn't come into play until we get into the September report. So we're on our way there. That's the next report. So we got that. There's a potential for a market to move by the numbers for the corn number projected 4 billion bushels of corn. That would be down from just under 5 last year for June 1st. So watching that, and really for the issue with the wheat market, one of the reasons we're slowing down so much in terms of prices along with harvest is that, gosh, it just looks like stocks are going to be large. Of course, our colleague Romulo Lollato will be coming on, I understand, and he'll talk more about what's actually happening out in the field. So I'm hesitant to make a lot of statements about that at this time. So these are two major reports. They have the potential to move the market, and we'll see what happens.
Dan, what are we seeing for futures?
Well, low futures. I would say anybody that's seen the wheat market of late has seen the drop off. We've dropped from a high about 2 weeks ago up to 575. Closed yesterday at 518 and a quarter. Had gotten down to that or just a little bit lower yesterday. Let's see on the trade. About 518 and 1/4 for the July contract. Remember, the July hard red winter wheat, soybean, and corn contracts are all just about to roll off. In fact, when you look at the volume of trade in those contracts, a lot of the volume of trading volume is actually already shifted to the next contract, which would be September for corn, for August for beans, and September for wheat. So anyway, we're basically looking at harvest lows. When you look at where we could go lower for wheat, if the harvest comes in pretty strong, the lowest that July contract's ever been is $5. So we got that. Soybeans have dropped off also in the last week, and part of that's again no perceived threat to the soybean crop. It had closed yesterday at 10.22 3/4. We had been spending quite a bit of time around 10.50, so we're down 20-30 cents. And you've got two lows out there as if the market perceives no threat going forward in the next 60 to 90 days, then we'll be looking at price levels like 980. The contract low for the July contract had gotten down to about 970, 968, something like that. So those are the type of metrics that we're looking for. And really what happens when we throw out numbers like that, when the market is kind of groping around to figure out, well, where do I go if I've got bearishness or bullishness at any one time? Well, you start paying attention to your recent history. Do I have enough momentum to go beyond onto high side or the low side of where I've been? And for corn, of course, corn has been really weak of late. In the last 3 or 4 days, it dropped precipitously, had been around 430 to 440. And here, just a recent period of time with the Brazil news coming into play and second crop corn looking projected to be a record high, and other factors at play. 409.5 was the close yesterday. And again, that's a drop from the 420 to 430 area. 430 to 440 that we'd been spending time at. So I think the markets aren't pricing any risk into any of the futures. So if something changes in the near future, when it would actually show up, then you'd be re-energized to go back to the higher side. But at this time, we see no signals of a risk to the crop as we're sitting here almost at July 1. So it doesn't mean that's where we'll end up at from here or far lower. But until something actually shows up to risk the production side, then this is probably where we're going. That said, low prices will tend to spur on usage. We're seeing really good corn usage in terms of exports, and ethanol holding up pretty good on the corn side. We'll see what the feed use number is coming out of that stocks report in a little bit. Grain sorghum, just about 3 million bushels, which is for the week ending June 19th, about the best number we've seen in months, in months, literally. So the grain sorghum exports starting to respond to low prices, so that's good. Soybean usage slowing down a little bit. I think the burden on the market of South American crop coming in and all of that is weighing on the soybean side of things. And so we'll see where that goes as well.
Dan, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you very much, Shelby.
That was K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our Friday show discussing wheat harvest with K-State wheat production specialist Romulo Lollato. Romulo, thanks for joining us today.
Hi, Shelby. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Romulo, beginning with where are we at with wheat harvest?
Well, wheat harvest this season has been slower than average, let's put it this way, right? And there's a few reasons for that. And how slow are we this year? But if you think of an early USDA report that came out just this week, they reported that wheat harvest progress in Kansas was about 20% this year. And if we compare this to last year, during this same report, in the same time of the year, we were 49% done. So this is like a very considerable slow in the pace of the wheat harvest. Now, of course, last year we harvested it fairly quick, right? Because of the conditions were good for harvest. But really, if we think of historically, we're supposed to be 30 to 40% harvested by this time of the year. And we're still halfway, right? And so we are definitely much slower than where we should have been. And there's really a couple of reasons for that slowness. One of them is simply we started later than usual. Right. I mean, it's not uncommon for us to see the first few wheat fields in Kansas be harvested in that late few days of May and early first days of June, especially in that Barber County region, central, southwest Kansas transition. However, this year, the first few reports that we were hearing about were about June 9th or so. So we're probably a full, at least about 10 days or so behind where we usually are simply in getting started. And then since we started there on June 9th, in the last couple of weeks here until today, there was a lot of rainfall that slowed down the harvest of the wheat crop. Actually, if we look statewide, accumulation of rainfall during these last 2 weeks, it ranged from, a couple of counties in the west central part of the state, they didn't get much rain, but really the majority of the state got anywhere from an inch all the way to 7 or 8 inches of rainfall. If you think of that McPherson region and the McPherson County and Rice County, parts of those counties, again, they got up to 7 or 8 inches of rainfall. So a lot of rain out there that definitely has also slowed down harvest progress.
What are some consequences when we look at harvest because we've received all this rain?
Definitely one of the things that we're concerned with all this rain, once the wheat crop is ready to be harvested, is anything that could reduce our yields, right? And then there's a number of factors that could actually lead to yield reduction on the wheat crop on this time. One of them, because of all that water that we were having, is waterlogging issues. Typically, we are concerned with waterlogging more during the crop development, active crop development, right? Because all that water will create anaerobic conditions in the soil, and wheat can't really handle too long in wet soils like that. So if this was happening, maybe 3-4 weeks ago, we would be concerned with just crop death due to anaerobic conditions and waterlogging. And that happened this year in parts of central Kansas, around Salina, and a little bit further west towards Dayton as well. I was in a few wheat fields that were showing quite a bit of waterlogging issues there. Now, late season waterlogging like these, they will actually delay progress of harvest because of this very, very wet soils that growers cannot drive on top, and also can increase the incidence of saprophytic fungi there. Other reason that could lead to yield losses here is lodging. There has been a lot of lodged wheat out there this year because of all of these rains. Now, just like waterlogging, right, we would be concerned with yield reductions due to lodging more if this lodging had happened a few weeks ago. So the earlier the lodging happens, the more yield loss we typically see from that lodging, right? Because it can disrupt translocation of those sugars going to the grain, or it can create a microclimate with more diseases. Early this year, right, or more when this lodging is occurring, when the wheat is almost mature and ready to be harvested, right? Again, it can really create difficulties in harvesting the crop. And so harvesting lodged wheat is not fun at all. It slows down the process. It increases a lot the amount of losses that we are having at that harvest itself, right? And so there are many reasons why lodging can actually reduce grain yield of the wheat crop there. So that's definitely one of the concerns as well. Now, associated with all of that, there's also the concern of grain shattering, right? We're actually seeing a lot of that this year. Now, there's a couple of reasons here for all the grain shattering that we're seeing this year. One of them, we had cool and moist conditions during grain filling, and that created the opportunity for some pretty nice large kernels out there. And if a variety is more prone for shattering, we started seeing really 3 or 4 weeks ago where some of those glooms were opened up. So the glooms, that structure that holds the wheat kernel, right, in the head, and they were already opened up, and that's a big risk for grain shattering right there. If, in the middle of the grain filling period, you're already being able to see the grains in the head because the gloom is open. So we were seeing quite a bit of that already earlier this month, before the wheat was even ready to harvest. And whenever these rains come by, they will get those kernels wet. Those kernels will increase in volume, and that will tend to open up those glooms even further, right? And so it can really, really increase the chances of losing all that grain. The grain is just going to fall down in the ground. Of course, there's differences in varieties and how they handle that. We kind of call that characteristics of with varieties. We call it gloom tenacity, right? And so some varieties that are able to hang into the grain better as the grain is drying down, they will be more valuable in this situation. Although we could hear concerns from growers in terms of varieties that are too hard to thresh, right? Which is the other way of this. But again, in a year like this, those varieties that are very hard to thresh, they can be valuable in making sure that we're not seeing that shattering go on. So again, grain shattering has been very prevalent this year. And that was a combination of all these rains that we had, again, opening up those glooms a little bit more, with very, very high winds. These storms, they came with a lot of wind as well, and that definitely did not help in terms of maintaining wheat kernels in the heads. Then maybe finally, the last thing that we can talk about in terms of yield reducing factors here, right, from all of these rains will be increased incidence of weeds. So you need to think that at this point in time, the wheat crop is not necessarily taking any more water. So any water that is out there available, it would be used by those growing weeds. So really no competition for those resources out there. And so all of this water really makes it for a really good, and those warm temperatures that we're having really make it for excellent conditions for weed emergence and weed development in the wheat canopy. Now, if the wheat canopy is very dense, in high yielding conditions where that underneath the canopy is extremely it has a lot of shade into it that can hold back the development of those weeds some. However, in this year, you might remember that we had quite a bit of a wheat streak mosaic around the state, and that has limited the yield potential of many of these fields. And with that limited yield potential, there's also a much smaller canopy, and that smaller canopy makes for a better environment for those weeds to grow. So we might be in a situation where we have a small canopy with a limited yield potential with lots of weeds coming up. So there are pre-harvest herbicide options, right? And we do have an update on that as well. When selecting those herbicides, it's important to keep in mind that they will have pre-harvest intervals, right? So some of them are 3 all the way to 10 or plus days that you need to wait until you're able to harvest the crop. So that's one thing to keep in mind when making that the herbicide selection.
Romulo, as we're talking about wheat harvest, how have growers been feeling about what's been coming out of their fields?
I think that the first few reports that we were having were fairly positive in terms of yield, right? Honestly, I heard reports from anywhere from 20 to 80 plus bushels per acre so far. But early on, they were actually being very positive because test weights were pretty good too, anywhere from 60 to 62 there. But here more recently, we're starting to get a few reports of test weights going down and fields where wheat streak mosaic was visible, but we're not expecting too much damage, actually yielding less than expected. So again, a very mixed bag in terms of what we're hearing from growers out there. But again, part of these concerns come back to some of those consequences of all of this water that we have recently here to our wheat crop, right? And one thing that I didn't mention before, but is that there are many quality aspects that get reduced as well whenever we have all this rain pre-harvest. Perhaps the most important one being test weight, right? Very briefly here, once those grains are re-wet, right, they will expand in volume, and they expand in volume because they are wet. Once they dry down, they never really dry down to the very same density that they were before. And so you have a larger kernel with the same weight, and that reduces the density, that reduces test weight. So that's definitely been one big concern from growers, is the reduced test weight due to all of these rain that we have had, and also the potential for pre-harvest sprouting of those grains. So growers, especially those growing white wheat, know that the crop can be pretty sensitive to pre-harvest sprouting, and all these rains really facilitate that process of the grain simply germinating in the head. And of course, we didn't talk about here, but there's some opportunistic fungi and that can come in this time of the year, and also some mycotoxin accumulation on the grain, especially in fields that were affected by head scab. But those are all things that can be consequences also of this amount of rain that we have been having so far.
Romulo, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you, Shelby. I appreciate being here.
That was K-State Wheat Production Specialist Romulo Lollato. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Friday show with a weather update from K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. Chip, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Chip, what variation of moisture have we seen this past week?
It's been a wet week for a lot of central Kansas again. A lot of the folks that saw precipitation last week found some more this week with persistent showers and storms. We have still that southwest flow, so it's taking storms from southwest Kansas into central Kansas, and then finally into northeast Kansas. And that's an area that was really void of precipitation a lot over the last several weeks and needed it badly. So some timely moisture for them. However, that means some other areas have dried out. While portions of central Kansas have seen up to 8 inches over the last 2 weeks, portions of southeast and northwest Kansas have missed out, and a lot of the precipitation have almost had no precipitation. In eastern Kansas, there's a pretty impressive gradient down through Coffee County and to the north and east from there, where we have a gradient of as much as like 5 inches of rain in the last 2 weeks in one part of the county to as little as less than a quarter inch of rain in the northeast part of the county. So some big differences. And that's what happens this time of year. We've got a really tropical air mass. It's still that influence of the East Pacific. We still have that tropical moisture funneling northward. So any thunderstorm's got a lot of moisture to work with. It dumps precipitation quickly and can lead to really isolated amounts of heavy rains over short periods of time.
And while we're thinking about storms, an important reminder about lightning.
Yeah, with these thunderstorms, we've had a lot of lightning. and we've had a lot of cold air aloft, and unfortunately, there's been a lot of lightning across most of the United States. Peak lightning season is June and July, where we see the greatest coverage of lightning across the United States in the summer months. And unfortunately, that can lead to injuries and even deaths due to lightning. A lot of people are doing stuff outside this time of the year, swimming, outdoor events, baseball, softball tournaments, and festivals. Everyone's at risk. And with more lightning, we're just putting ourselves at more risk than we normally would any other time of the year. We just had an incident here in South Carolina in the last week where there were 20 people swimming in a lake. It was sunny skies over the lake, but there was a storm about 8 miles away that was starting to approach them, and it dropped a bolt way out into the sun of that lake and unfortunately hurt 20 people, including 12 children. So we need to be responsible. We need to have an action plan and be aware if storms are forecasted, which they are for most days. It seems like right now we're in that kind of that wetter pattern, or that positive feedback pattern where we have moisture at the surface, and so we're going to get moisture out of thunderstorms in the afternoons. We're going to have lightning with them, and we need to at least have a plan, a safe place to go to take cover during those lightning events.
Are we going to continue to see moisture?
Yes, we have a cold front that's moved through Thursday night and into Friday morning, and that brought much cooler air and drier air. Much cooler. It's all relative. It's summer in Kansas, so instead of being 95, it'll be 90. But northern Kansas especially would be precipitation free on Friday. Still some lingering storms to the south, and then we see that warm air move back northward on Sunday and Saturday, and pop-up showers and storms. Not quite the organization we've seen over the last week where we had these complexes kind of tracking along the same track. These are going to be more erratic and sporadic and probably not last as long, which are the dangerous ones because you can go from no storm to storm in 15, 20 minutes. But then another front comes through Sunday into Monday. We should be relatively dry, I think, across the state Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Then it looks like that moisture returns later in the week, closer to the 4th of July, Thursday, Friday, and a boundary sets up again, this time oriented a little different. It's going to be more east-west oriented. So we're going to end up with more probably severe weather of complexes of storms that will try to traverse the plains. We'll see how far they get east off the mountains. They're forming off that monsoonal moisture that's starting to become more prevalent in the southwestern United States. They form off the mountains and they try to move east across the plains. And some days they might be more successful at moving eastward depending on what the high pressure does to the east. And so we'll just watch out. Chances of storms a lot of the days, and it's going to keep going until we can get into a drier pattern. And with the monsoonal moisture in the southwest now, it's going to be hard to get a prolonged dry pattern, I think, at least in the middle of July.
Chip, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Yep, thanks for having me.
That was K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. That's all we have for you this week on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you on Monday.